Welcome, welcome, welcome. Happy International Working Women's Day. Happy Women's History Month. My name is Ben Ramos. I'm the coordinator of Pro Libertad here in New York City. I want to welcome and thank all of you for being with us today. I'm going to keep my interjections into this very short because you came here to listen to this all-star panel that we put together. Pro Libertad, since its inception, has had a commitment to uplifting women, whether they were political prisoners or the women within our communities that are the leaders. The fact of the matter is, in the history of our national liberation struggle, women's contributions are often invisibilized, erased, or completely ignored. And Pro Libertad has always had a vested interest in highlighting, affirming, spotlighting the fact that women are the backbone of our community. And not just the backbone, they've been the arms, the legs, the brain, the body. Our sisters have always been guerrilleras at the forefront, no matter what the way history was reshaped. So we want to take a moment. Pro Libertad has always taken moments to reclaim that history and to bring it out to what it is, to educate on it. So today, IWWD, in the middle of Women's History Month, we're going to talk about the Latin Women's Collective and the history, the legacy, and the work. I'm done. I'm going to introduce our first panelist. She'll talk about who she is. She'll do a better intro of herself than I could. I want to call Lillian Jimenez.
Oh my goodness. Hi. Actually, I'm gonna let Lulu start because Lulu wants to do an intro on what is International Working Women's Day. Most of us, especially the baby boomers, we know it as International Women's Day, but for many of us who come out of the Puerto Rican left, it's International Working Women's Day. So Lulu, could you please just, preface all of this with what is International Working Women's Day?
Okay, very quickly, in 1910, there was a conference of an International Socialist Women's Conference in Copenhagen. And one of the women, Clara Zetkin, seeing the different struggles that women were carrying out around the world, felt that there should be a Working Women's Day, not just an International Women's Day, but a Working Women's Day. And different women took up that struggle in different parts of the world. Here in the United States, one of the issues that really brought that to the forefront was in 1911, hundreds of immigrant women died in the garment district in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The owners shut the factory. They locked it, the chains with chains. The women could not get out when a fire broke out. There were all kinds of safety hazards and conditions there. And hundreds of women died. These were young immigrant women. They were burned. Other women managed to jump out of windows and their bodies just landed on the ground and they died. And that's also critical for us today when we look at what's happening with immigrant women in this country. Working women continue to be exploited, continue to be oppressed, continue to work under the worst possible conditions. These are the working women who right now are being chased out of this country, the immigrant women. These are the women who have served as nannies, as maids, as all kinds of people who are unpaid and who are exploited because many of them are undocumented. So it's something for us to bear in mind today of what's happening with immigrant women in this country, working women, what's happening with working women all over the world, women who are in refugee camps with their children. We can look at the women in Gaza. We can look at what's happening right now with women in Africa. All over the world, there are women who are being exploited and oppressed. So International Working Women's Day is a day not just to be giving flowers to women or stuff like that, but to think about what is happening to women. How are they being exploited? How are we being, manipulated? How are we being oppressed? How our cultures are being destroyed? Our families are being destroyed. Our villages are being destroyed. And yet we are fundamentally important because a lot of the world's food producers are women.
Right.
You go to any country and you'll see women working in the fields. So we need to, consider that with that context, then look at what we were trying to do with the Latin Women's Collective 50 years ago and what continues to be relevant to us today as women.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. That was excellent, Lulu. Boy, I could not have done that, honey. So I'm so happy that you agreed to do it. So I'm going to just do a really quick introduction. I'm Lillian Jimenez. I was born and raised in Harlem, West Harlem. New York, and I'm a baby boomer. I was a student organizer in college, and then I joined the Comité. I was one of the founders with other many women of the Latin Women's Collective and was with it for 3 years, landing up in the steering committee, much to my dismay at the time. And in that time, since that time, I've been a media advocate and worked with immigrants, and most recently was working in Rockland County supporting the Palestinians and advocating against the genocide, and now want to advocate against the genocide in Cuba. I am, as 6 years ago, I retired and then I took a full-time job. So I do work as an anti-human trafficking case manager. So I see the abuse. I really see it. Anyway, I did want to say two things before I start about the beginnings of the Latin Women's Collective. One is that memory is really subjective. And so that, we're all going to remember the Latin Women's Collective in a really different way, really based on, what our positions were in the Latin Women's Collective, what we remember because of our age at this point, and also in terms of, our own sort of political analysis and how we analyze our reality and the reality around us. So we're going to hear different variations of the Latin Women's Collective. If you ask anybody who was in the collective, you're going to hear different things. So that's the first thing. The second thing I wanted to say is that I wanted to honor the women who were in the Latin Women's Collective, either as members or supporters, who have passed, and that is Margie Washinger, Betsy Blanco, Marieta Sermoneta, Blanca Vasquez, Emily Molina. If I have left anybody out and people remember the other women who have passed since that time, if you're on, please put it in the chat and we can then say their names later on. I want to talk about how the Latin Women's Collective was formed. Some of us had come out of political organizations that started out as community-based and then, studied Marxism and became socialists in some way. I say rudimentary socialists. And we decided that we needed an organization that was going to work with women. We were very much anti the Vietnam War, most of us, and had worked in our communities organizing, and were very much really sort of impelled into political organizing because of all of the national wars of liberation in what we would at the time call the Third World. So Cuba, India, Algeria. I mean, we were just so cognizant of all of the ways in which oppressed people were rising up. We were also really aware of the role of the United States in really, dismantling many progressive and democratically organized countries, in particular in Chile, when the CIA overthrew Salvador Allende, and we were all totally taken aback by that. Some of us had attended conferences with the Vietnamese women in Canada. There were two. I went to the first one as a representative of a comité. The second one I didn't go to. And the women who went to the second conference decided that they were going to really listen to the Vietnamese women and organize Latina women. I got pulled into it because of Nancy Miranda Colón, who said to me, women are organizing after this conference. Do you want to do it? And I had been feeling like I wasn't doing a lot of political work. So I said, yeah, I'll do it. It's fine. I'm interested. So ultimately, the Latin Women's Collective was a mix of women who came from predominantly working class backgrounds, but who were themselves I would say middle class, lower middle class, what we would consider petit bourgeois women, myself included. And then we had a small circle of women who were really in the working class, very much. We tried to organize ourselves in a democratic manner as a collective. And so our structure was we had a steering committee, which was composed of individuals from each of the committees that we organized. And those committees were internal affairs. Internal affairs recruited people, provided orientations for them, did fundraising, was able to get us an office in East Harlem, etc. We had the labor committee, which actually all three of us were in the labor committee. We had the health committee, and then we had the education committee. We had members and then we had supporters, people who could not give the time that it took. We were the most bureaucratic organization I've ever been involved in. And by that, I mean, we had the most copious minutes of the meetings. And I only say this because SB Blanca and I were involved in trying to recuperate our history. And so we went to the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and we looked at all these minutes, and they were just absolutely extraordinary. And somebody, I think it was Blanca before she passed, did a sort of a summary of each steering committee meeting and the items that were discussed. And in 1976, I hope Lulu talks about it, Dykes and Tykes, we were going to have a conversation about the gay question back in 76, which is, phenomenal to me. So we had these committees and we really tried to be as democratic as possible. We were very, very much focused on developing what we call now local leadership. We wanted to develop the leadership of women. We had women from various political organizations. We had women from the Comité. We had women from the Puerto Rican Socialist Party. I can't remember anybody else. Somewhere it's written that somebody from the Lords was with us, but I don't remember anybody from the Lords. And I knew a lot of the people from the Lords because I used to do a lot of security with them as a representative of a comité. And so we really struggled to be democratic. But the reality is that many of us came from democratic centralist organizations. And so that was really the way we were used to operating. And so I think that creeped into. Plus, the other thing we realized was that there was a lot of uneven development. Some of us were, considered ourselves Marxists, socialists. We had organizing experience. We had theoretical development, political development. And a lot of the women who came in did not. And so we were really trying to even things out by providing political education, which was really important. We looked at women's health as an entire organization, and there was a book that we used, Our Bodies, Ourselves, I think it was called.
Yeah.
And that really helped. I think one of the key subtext of the collective was that we learned how to help women process their emotions and their feelings. We really helped create a level of solidarity with women. We had been socialized to be very negative with each other, very competitive, very judgmental. I mean, that was just our reality. And so the collective was really struggling to break that down and create solidarity and comradeship, compañerismo. And I think in many ways we were really successful in doing that. We had a situation once where we believed in accountability. We had a situation where a man from another organization beat up one of our members. And in the steering committee, we had a conversation about that, how we were going to hold this man accountable. Some of us wanted to kick his ass. That was the accountability we wanted. But, fairer minds prevailed. And so we went to the organization and we met with them. And thank God that the organization that we met with was headed primarily by a woman who had started the Third World Women's Alliance. And so they held that person accountable for his violation of our member. And that was a really important lesson for us in terms of how you hold people accountable and how you don't become the monsters that you are fighting against. I think that was the other kind of subtext that emerged for some of us. It was a really important time in many of our lives. And I think I'll say that the impact of the collective was very different on different individuals. We did a series of interviews with about 13 to 15 women, supporters, members, and 201 people said the collective changed my life. And when we said, well, how? They could not articulate. And I think it's because of the fact that it was the first time that in an organization, they were treated with respect, with compassion. They were asked to be their true selves, where socialization does not allow us to be our true selves. It wants us to be these, I don't know, Minnie Mouse characters, that are totally defined by patriarchy. And we were saying, we're not down with the patriarchy. We want to make sure that women are leaders because we have innate abilities to be leaders. And so many women said that the Latin Women's Collective saved their lives. Out of the Latin Women's Collective, a number of important initiatives happened. The International Working Women's Committee was definitely something that came out of the collective. The collective ended in 1978. There were some political differences in the organization, and there were some strategic differences. And so the Education Committee, who had been working out of the storefront on 115th Street, had some ideas about who should be making decisions because they were working with the working class people from that community. And so there was a big rift in the organization. And the way that it was handled was not well. I must say, there were not some comradeship lessons there. And so many of us left. And we left formally. So some of us wrote letters saying, this is why we're leaving. We wish the organization well. By, the end of 78, the organization did not exist anymore. The other things I think that came out of the collective International Working Women's Day, we started to honor Puerto Rican women. And for a number of years, we would develop these wonderful events at any place that we could find, a large venue, and we would just honor Puerto Rican women. We would do plays and we would have, childcare for the children. We would have plays for them. We would ask, actors, actresses that we knew, and they would perform for us. We had musical performances. Lulu spoke her very first, I think, speaking engagement at one of our international working women's events. My sister, who had never spoken in her life, did the same thing with Lilian Rosado. I still remember. So we had an interesting impact in that people still wanted to come together. The other thing I think that came out of it was that processing of our emotions. We were so insecure when we first walked in, some of us, and some of us, even with political experience, were still pretty insecure. And so the processing of our emotions and our fears and our concerns was something that many of the women took into consideration, and they formed the First World Women's Healing Circle. And out of that First World Women's Healing Circle came Casa Atabek's Ache in the South Bronx. And some of us participated with them and learned about healing and processing our emotions in a much deeper way. And about developing local leadership, again, in a much deeper way. Blanca went on to work at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies. She founded the journal. She started teaching. I went and started doing media advocacy on an international level. I'm not an international, sorry. I'm overstating it, a national level. And worked in philanthropy for many years. I'm in my third career now. So the collective had an incredible impact. Every place that I have gone, I can't speak for anybody else. And every place that I have gone, I have really tried to develop local leadership. So the most recent was been Rockland for Ceasefire, which was working against the genocide in Palestine. And a number of mostly women, but some men too, and some trans people have really become organizers as a consequence of the work that we did. So the Latin Women's Collective was very important. The last thing I'll say is that for young women who are thinking about organizing, and I don't know how many are on this Zoom, looking at the history of women's development, the things that work, the lessons learned, always the lessons learned, and study. There has to be about theoretical political development and working in a democratic and a compassionate way. And that is one thing that I have learned from the young people of today. They are far more compassionate than we were when we were coming up because most of us were trained, some of us were trained when we came out of these political organizations. They were paramilitary trainings that we went through. So compassion wasn't something we were really into. And these young people have really taught us compassion. So there are things for the young women of today to continue to teach us in the way that they organize for their liberation.
Thank you, Lillian. Thank you. Folks, I want to introduce Lourdes Garcia to our panel. Lourdes?
Hi, everybody. I was in El Comité MIMP, which was a political organization. As Lillian mentioned, it has started as a community organization and had transitioned slowly into a Marxist-Leninist organization. At the time, we weren't fully Marxist-Leninist. We were mostly El Comité hacia el MIMP, Movimiento de Izquierda Nacional Puertorriqueño. And I was in the Women's Commission and was assigned to work in the Latin Women's Collective. At the time, I was also a welder, and I was in a women's program where it was women who were being trained to be welders. We were all, women from different working class backgrounds. We were from the Bronx, we were from the Lower East Side, etc. And one of the groups of women that was in there were lesbian women. And we were in a boys' school where they had set up a shop room for us. So going through the gauntlet of boys, some of these women were going through changes. Um, Today, they might be considered transgender or, whatever, but back then, they just were called dykes. And the women went through changes, and I was organizing and working with them. And it came at a time when we were approached in the Latin Women's Collective by a group of lesbian women who were being threatened to have their children taken away from them. And they had formed an organization, a coalition called Dykes and Tykes. And I really took it up because having been being in a welding program with lesbians and learning about lesbians who were also mothers in that program, I felt very compassionate, and I was just outraged at the idea that someone's child could be taken away from them because the mother was a lesbian. Not because she was a bad mother, abusive, anything, a lesbian. So we brought that up in when Dykes and Tykes approached us. We discussed it in the Latin Women's Collective, and we were outraged. The whole Latin Women's Collective, I think, was outraged. Like, what? What's going on here? And they asked us to march with them. And we marched with them. We marched behind the banner that said Dykes and Tykes. And I remember I had gone to El Comite and said, we got to march and we need to provide security. And some of the men in the organization were like, what? No. Yes, we have to march and provide security. If you start taking away a lesbian mother's child, tomorrow it could be any woman's child that can be taken away for any freaking reason, and violating her rights as a mother. So we wound up having some of the brothers from El Comité, grudgingly providing security so that we could march as women, all of us marching as women, Dykes and Tykes and the Latin Women's Collective supporting them. They had other women's groups supporting them as well. That was an issue that really hit us and that outraged us. Another thing that outraged us and that we worked very strongly with, and Lillian started to talk about our work with Puerto Rican women, was the sterilization abuse that Puerto Rican women have been subjected to. We learned, because of course history is not written by the working people, it's not written by those who are fighting. History is written by the conquerors, right? By the exploiters and the oppressors. And we learned that through a period of a 20-year decade, 20-year period, over 30% of Puerto Rican women of childbearing age have been sterilized, forcibly sterilized against their will, sterilized without their knowledge. And we wound up working with a wonderful woman doctor called Dr. Helen Rodriguez Trias, who was very instrumental in the struggle against sterilization abuse. She gave us a lot of information. She helped us to understand what the issue was. And we also had conflicts with the broader women's movement at that time, because yes, there was a women's movement, but it was basically white, petty bourgeois and bourgeois feminists who were fighting for legitimate things like, women having access to bank accounts, having access to mortgages, having access to credit cards. Women were completely economically dependent on men, but we didn't even have access to any of that, as Puerto Rican women. So to us, it was, okay, we want to struggle around economic rights, but we're talking about women working in the garment industry. We're talking about women who are being exploited and oppressed in all kinds of other areas. And they were concerned about abortion rights. Again, an issue that we did, find important, but we were mostly focused on sterilization abuse because we couldn't even talk about abortion. Where were the women going to get an abortion? Even if they set up abortion clinics, they still had to pay money to get abortions. It was still expensive. And meanwhile, we were faced with a real genocidal attack on us as a people with the sterilization abuse program that had been put in place and that was still being carried out. Another thing we learned about was that the birth control pill, had been tested in Puerto Rico. And they had used high levels of hormones, and women had all kinds of terrible, disastrous effects as a result of that pill. Once they were able to use the pill on our people in Puerto Rico, on our women, and I believe also on African American women here and indigenous women, Hawaiian women, testing all of this, but Puerto Rico became like the real, ground for testing. Then they were able to eventually market it to the broader population here, to women in this country. So we were a guinea pig there as well. There was all kinds, so it wasn't just independence of Puerto Rico, but looking at the genocide, sterilization abuse, the pill, using us as guinea pigs in every way possible, and then exploiting us when we come here as working people in factories. We struggled also around the issue of we talked about healthcare. That's why we had the healthcare committee. When we did the labor committee, we studied, wages that women got. We looked at the garment industry. We looked at what's happening with working women. We studied education, the lack of daycare, the lack of decent schools for our children. So the Latin Women's Collective was trying to look at all of these different issues and study them. We did research. We put out materials on them. I remember Lillian was talking about some of the events we had. I remember an event where Lilian Rosado, I think it was Lilian Rosado, came carrying with a torso we had breasts. It had soft breasts with lumps so that we could learn about breast cancer, because we didn't know how to do tests. Now it's become more commonplace for women to learn how to do self-tests, but we didn't know anything about that back then. And she had come carrying with this mannequin at one of our events, and women were like going up and very carefully touching the breast to feel the lumps and understand this is breast cancer. Or it could be benign, but if you have a lump, you should go to a doctor. Those were the days in which you did not question doctors. You didn't question authority in any way. Doctors were authority figures. Teachers were authority figures. Everybody was an authority figure. And so if you felt unwell as a woman and went to a doctor and said, I don't feel well, they probably gave you a pill because you were anxious and hysterical. They'd give you Valium or give you some other thing to calm you down. And in fact, you might have been suffering from some terrible disease. So these were things that we began to explore and discuss in the Latin Women's Collective in our meetings. And that really impacted us. Some of us cried in those meetings. There was a lot of crying at different times. But the fact that we cried and that we felt able to cry was because there was a safe space. Within the whole issue of providing criticism and self-criticism, which we did do in the Latin Women's Collective, we were much gentler than the criticism and self-criticism that I had to deal with in El Comité. Because the Latin Women's Collective provided a safer space where women could feel compassion for one another, and feel some empathy over a woman going through different changes, or a woman not understanding what was going on in the meeting. Sometimes women were just so, they felt frustrated, or they felt like, I must be stupid. I don't know what's going on. You guys are talking about things I don't understand, and so trying to find that balance between those of us who had a level of political consciousness, as Lillian said, and took sometimes for granted, right, that people understood what we were talking about, and women who were coming into just the understanding that I'm a woman and I have needs and I need to learn more about this. And that balance was, sometimes okay, sometimes like this, sometimes, we managed to find balances. My first experience that really impacted me, aside from all these other things, was having to speak in public. We had an IWWD event, and Espi, Esperanza Martel, one of the founders of the Latin Women's Collective, really pushed me. I mean, like pushed for me to be the speaker at that event. And I had never spoken in public. I had led study groups in El Comité. I was organizing workers because I was studying to be a welder, and I had then gone on to work in factories, but I had never spoken publicly. And so I had to sit and write a speech, and it was corrected and it was edited, and people gave me feedback. And SP taught me different things. And the Latin Women's Collective in general said to me, look in the mirror and practice it. Don't look at anybody's face when you're talking, because if they yawn or they scratch, you're going to freak out thinking that it's because of you. So look above people's heads. Hold on to the podium if you're nervous. I did it, and it was successful. Of course, I almost had a heart attack. And I always felt like I was going to have a heart attack. By the time I walked off the stage, I was shaking from head to toe. And I remember SB grabbing me and hugging me because I was going to fall. But that was an experience that I had never had. I had not been taught to do public speaking. It began a process of me gaining the confidence where today I can do this kind of speaking. Another thing I learned in the Latin Women's Collective was with the minutes, being able to synthesize people's what was being said, meaning paying attention at a whole other level. What's being said, what's being agreed to, um, what are the things that the tasks that are up ahead. So organizing myself to be in a meeting in a way that I focused differently. I wasn't just sitting there listening. I was now listening in a specific way. Chairing a meeting, how to chair meetings. We had to learn how to chair a meeting. So that meant you had to come prepared with the agenda, right? What was the previous discussion? What are we supposed to discuss today? Which is why the minutes were so critical and why we became really anal about minutes, because the Latin Women's Collective, we had a group of women sitting around. We weren't five women. We were a group of women sitting around in a circle, and we needed to come prepared, and those meetings had to be on point. We couldn't just sit there rambling away. So the minutes were critical to us saying, okay, this was what we discussed last time we met. These were the agreements. These are the tasks we were supposed to do. And then, okay, where are we at with these tasks? What's happening with the labor committee's report? What's happening with the research that the education committee is supposed to be doing? What's happening with that event that we're organizing with the international work? Who's doing the cooking? Who's doing this? When are we meeting again? How much money do we have? Those things were all part of the minutes. And so, yes, we were anal about the minutes, but the minutes kept us on track so that we didn't lose track of the things that we needed to do and the tasks that were in front of us. So I learned that. I learned the minutes. I learned how to lead meetings. I learned how to organize and prepare myself to speak in public. These were things that the Latin Women's Collective gave to me. One of the things that we also did that I think was important was that we worked with other women's groups. We learned to work with other women's groups. Some of those groups disappeared, they didn't stay around long, but we learned to sit with other women's groups. We learned to discuss issues we had in common. We participated together with them in different ways. Sometimes it was just sending a solidarity message, or offering our solidarity and support. But it was important. It allowed us to reach out to other women and to other groups and to learn what was happening in different sectors of our own community. Because the Puerto Rican community doesn't live in a vacuum. We lived with African Americans, we lived with all kinds of other working people. And so learning about the struggles of other people allowed us to do that kind of solidarity work, that kind of internationalism, which is what International Working Women's Day should be about, right? So it was important, the Latin Women's Collective gave us that too, and gave me that too, gave me more of that. El Comité trained me in many ways, gave me a lot of analytical tools, gave me a sense of, a purpose, a struggle for justice. But the Latin Women's Collective really tweaked a lot of that and really helped to sharpen a lot of that and really introduced me to new ways to be a better cadre. Eventually, I wound up in the steering committee too, much to my dismay as well. I did not want to be in the steering committee. But eventually I was pulled out of the Latin Women's Collective because I was heading study groups for El Comité. I was working in a factory by then in Hoboken. I was, just doing a lot of internal work for El Comité. And I was also organizing the education struggle in the Lower East Side, the Por los Niños struggles, to get community control of our schools in the Lower East Side. So I was really going to be overextended if I had remained in the Latin Women's Collective. And I was already feeling it physically and mentally, like, oh my God, I cannot do one more meeting. When do I wash my clothes? When do I shop? When do I cook? When do I sleep? Especially because I was working in a factory, and that really took a toll on me. So these were some of the issues and some of the reasons why I wound up being pulled out of the Latin Women's Collective, even though I really was enjoying my time in the Latin Women's Collective. It was challenging. It was invigorating. It was exhilarating. At times I wanted to cry myself, but it was a new way of me finding myself as a Puerto Rican woman and finding my voice as a Puerto Rican woman, which helped me tremendously years later when I had to sit in coalitions with other people, especially with men who, I would say something and then 20 minutes later, some man would repeat it. And I'd be like, I just said that. Oh, I didn't hear that, And so being able to find my voice and say, I said that. I remember being in some coalition many years later in a solidarity group, And I said I was, pissed off, and this man was on my nerves and this and that. And then he called me a bitch, and I looked at him and I said, "And your point is," I said, and he just froze. I said, "And your point is," so something I would never have been able to challenge. I would have maybe just shut up. But I called him a couple of things after that, and it became very clear that I was not somebody who was ever going to shut up again and be quiet. I was a cadre. I was a Puerto Rican woman. I was a revolutionary Puerto Rican woman, and I had plenty to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lulu. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is one of our radical elders here in New York City. I want to introduce Ana Juarve.
All right, I guess this is my turn now. Gee, I feel like I learned so much about the Latin Women's Collective listening to Lillian and to you, Lulu, because my stint with the Latin Women's Collective was a whole lot shorter. I think I left about 1975, so I was really more involved in its early formation. And it's what I needed then. I thought that when I was asked to speak, I was a little bit surprised. Not asked to speak. I found a flyer and it had my face on it. And it said this event was taking place. And I didn't even know who sent it to me, but that's okay. I forgive you, Benjamin Ramos. I am glad because I am still working on public speaking. It doesn't hurt for me to, try it out again. I thought that for myself, I have to say something about who I am and how, because we all grow, no matter whether it's left or right. We're growing politically, we're growing culturally, we're growing as mothers, as women, so I think my presentation is a little bit different. When I became involved with the Women's Collective after, like Lillian said, after that, I think it must have been that second Canadian conference that brought the Vietnamese women. So before that, I frankly, I was getting politicized, but just the way there's so many more people active now with what's going on in the world with ICE and Trump and all of that, So I'm talking about a period of 1968 to about 1975. And, I've always, all my life, as a teenager, I would read a lot about the Second World War. Wait, I want to change my view because I have my view, Lulu, your beautiful face, but I want a gallery view. Okay. And so, I was always, I don't know why war exists. I didn't even understand the civil rights movement. I come from a very sheltered Puerto Rican family. I didn't know what the difference between an immigrant or an American was. Obviously Puerto Ricans, because of the colonialization of the island, became American, from the moment you're born. And so the Vietnam War was very intense, and I had graduated in '66 from a school called Central Commercial, and Carmen Martel, who was also one of the leaders of El Comité and the, she's a fabulous woman. You want to be around her because she's always so smart and so funny and so real. So anyway, but I went to that school and I was not one of the funny ones. I was very, very, shy. And, so when I graduated, I went to college, in New York City Community College. I dropped out after the first first or second semester. I didn't know what was going on, And so and my friend who was there at the college with me was working in a factory, burglar alarm factory. Anyway, I don't want to get into that. But the point was, I went from, a very sheltered kind of experience to work then in a factory. And I was working in the office. Obviously, I wasn't, I had already been to college, and I wanted more in my life. But I really had to go back, go to work, because my family needed help in terms of a lot of things, because my father had been sick. But anyway, through that, and then I started, developing as a woman. And in 1968, I had a boyfriend who was at Columbia studying. And I got a job. He suggested, why don't you get out of the factory and, apply for a job at Columbia. And I did that. And that was like, talk about, if I didn't know what was going on in college, I didn't know what was going on at Columbia, because there was the takeover. I didn't, I didn't understand, I knew it had to do with the war and all of that. And so, it was just a lot of turmoil. And I was working at the Office of General Studies, and there were a lot of white women, very few. There was one Black person and one Latina. That was me. And so, here they were talking about Juan Gonzalez, who was this handsome leader, and a young lord, whatever, that he was a leader in the takeover. And so, I was curious, and, so I learned a little bit about him. But by 1969, there was a killing of students at Kent State University. And that really was very upsetting. And now I'm, in this Columbia University atmosphere, and they're talking about that. And so, I was like, whoa, what's going on? And so I heard that William Kunstler was coming to campus to speak. And so I went to listen to him speak about the war and all the connections that a person like him makes. And I ended up marching with all the people who had been at Kunstler's speech to City College, because they were on strike there because of the open admissions, Puerto Rican studies. And so, wow, it was just, from 68 to 69, now I'm marching, I never thought of marching before. And it could have only been, someone like Kunstler, who was such a great speaker. And I learned about why I had ended up at City College. I ended up by myself ultimately, and I had to get back home, on my own. But that comes back to me, because here I am at Columbia, and there are all these Latino students, and they start, organizing. The building I was in had an urban center, a Latino urban center of some sort. And a woman called Hildemar Ortiz was working there. Now, Hildemar Ortiz was a leader in PRSU and and very active in the open admissions at City College. And so this was like, and the students, I started to take some courses I did start to take some courses at general studies, but they were like Korean art, Spanish literature. I could at least do some of that. But I even took this English course, a basic English course, and I got my paperback red marks. I dropped that class so fast. I said, because I considered myself that I could write, and I was an avid reader. And here I was, they were, telling me what I was saying was no good. Anyway, the point was that I dropped out of those classes. But in the process, I met other people who were taking courses. And it just opened up the world for me. Then the students who were organizing on the campus had a PRSU chapter. And this was people like Frank Algarin, Pedro Pedraza. There was also on campus the Latin American Studies Organization, Angelo Falcon, Jose Sanchez, Emilio Carrillo, Aiza Reyes, all these people. And a lot of them were from Puerto Rico, and a lot of them were just brilliant students. They had gone to Brooklyn Tech, Brown's High School of Science, all of that stuff. Really smart people. So these were the people around me, and then I met Marieta Selmoneta. Really, that's why I'm here. I have to admit, Marieta Selmoneta. I met Sandy Trujillo, Barnard. These people, it was fun to be around them. And, frankly, I was so colonized. I was just so I was working, and as I was out there because my mother, she doesn't know what the word feminism means. I mean, my mother's passed. But my mother was a strong ass woman, and she, my father had gotten sick. So she was she was the boss, and I had to work, and I had, so I was out there because she pushed me out the door, and so I met these people, these women like Hilda Martis is no faint flower, ella being, assertive, tall, strong looking woman también. And I'm getting a little lost here. But it was just all this stuff going on around me was challenging me to be better.
So Ana, can you talk about the Latin Women's Collective and what happened there?
I'm getting there, but I'm trying to set the foundation for who I am, because frankly, after 2 years or 3 years in the Women's Collective, I left it because I felt like there was an imposition almost. But I love the women there, especially Esperanza, because when she came to me after the Canadian Women's conference and said, they were starting a women's group, I was just thrilled, And the point was that I had been in a couple of groups before that with Marieta and Sandy, we were very women centered. And then I went into a group because Marieta was invited and she brought me along, which was with Helen Rodriguez, Aida Quascut, Francia Luban. It was like a mixed group. And Marieta was the one who brought me into the group, and and Helen and Aida, all of them spoke so honestly about their experiences as women and their development, because Helen was one of the leaders of the Lincoln takeover también, because she was a doctor there, and because her family had been very involved, I guess, during the Depression at some point in movement stuff, with the Communist Party, but that was like a very important experience for me, and I wanted to stay connected to people like that. So Helen was one of the people who went up to Canada, and I remember getting on the bus with her and her daughter and her son, I just felt safe being around her, and of course Marieta, I think, was there, or I'm not sure who was there. I just know by that point I was connecting with a lot of different kinds of women, and so that was the beginning of my wanting, identifying. I was always like a kind of a feminist, but I learned through the Latin Women's Collective what it meant to also be a womanist, to really value ourselves and see what we bring, and that it's not just about taking off your bra and being just being so like there was this whole liberation thing, you're a liberated woman. So anyway, so And so SP was just wonderful because when she said, we're going to start this women's group. And I thought, nobody else was talking about this. So I thought she was talking to me, like, we're going to start this group. And she was talking to me about we're starting a group, right? But I didn't know anybody else who was a part of this except, for Helen and Marietta. And all of us eventually ended up in the Women's Collective. And it was such an exciting time. And Esperanza was such a great organizer. And she was doing work also for the Puerto Rican political prisoners, which I think, that's part of what made her such a great leader, because her love for the Puerto Rican people. She was someone also who would, by that time, I think she had graduated from City College. But so there was a lot that was going on that it was challenging for me. And most of all, expressing myself was very hard. I really, I do have a lot of difficulty sometimes speaking up. Some of it might have to do with some of the hearing issues that I have, but I managed, I participated, I was very excited. There were new friendships I made. I saw that and even from the very beginning, there was a lot of, discipline required to be in the group. And, it had to be prepared. Some of what you were saying, Lulu, there was a lot of studying we had to do. We read really hard materials. I think it was dialectical historical materialism. We read Mao on liberalism. And it was a lot, but I stuck through it, and really for the best, because it has informed my political thinking till the present. The other thing I learned, because I really, like I said, come from a very sheltered kind of experience. Even our family thing was very sheltered. We were a nucleus. All our family was in Puerto Rico or in other states. And, so, we have family things, but this was at another level. I learned to organize activities, events, how to develop flyers, very basic things, and that was empowering for me. I do want to say then we were, with Helen, we also got involved. There were a lot of groups that were active at that point. It was El Comité. Yes, El Comité was a community group. That's how I saw it. But, I didn't know that there were so many people working in factories and in other schools and that kind of stuff. But there was also, the Young Lords were on campus at the PRSU already, because
Anna, you have frozen.
Anna, you're frozen.
Organization. They identified campus. Oh. Well, I don't. Am I still frozen?
No, you're fine.
Anyway, yeah, no. So my point was that this, before the Latin Women's Collective, I was already meeting people from other persuasion, not other persuasions. All this was around Liberate Puerto Rico Now. That's the first time I met Juan Gonzalez. What is that? A Liberate Puerto Rico Now committee that was organized by the Latin American Student Organization. I met the comité. I met because of some squatters work that was being done on 111th Street in Amsterdam. This was all related to Colombia, and all of these were all the people who eventually became part of the Latin Women's Collective, and because the work was very much around the liberation of Puerto Rico and like I said, liberation of the Puerto Rican nationalists, the political prisoners. So like I was saying, the discipline, my biggest challenge was writing. And I remember uh, before I left, I read Francis Fox Piven, and I had to write something, and I really was so tortured writing it, and being very upset, and I know I was rambling like I'm doing a little bit now, but the point was that I was coming into another level of consciousness and commitment that was very empowering for me, and I think that that's the thing about the Latin Women's Collective, that it was empowering because it wasn't just one or two of us, but it was like in a collective kind of setting, and that gave me a lot of safety. And so not only was it the work in sterilization abuse and learning about it, but it was also the work about the political prisoners. There was work around Cuba, the Cuban Women's Federation. I learned about that. And I went back to school during that time, and I started to, engage more systematically in learning and writing and that kind of stuff. I don't know. And, I don't really have much more to say because, for me, my formation is still ongoing. And, there was, the doubts are still there somewhere, but I did one of the things that I think has always been part of my identity has been my experience as a worker, because coming from that factory to Colombia was very, intense. And in the Latin Women's Collective, there was there was a lot of diversity in terms of the women, but a lot of them were, like Lillian said, people, teachers, people who had gone through the college experience. But El Comité, I think, was an anchor in terms of the fact that their leadership, they were very much involved they had a lot of members who were very disciplined and brought added to the differences in experiences of many of the women. But so that was more or less my experience in the Latin Women's Collective.
Thank you, Anna. That was good.
Yeah, no, what
Thank
I
you.
want to say is, can I get, yeah, time really flew. Okay, basically, I became like, I came in like, about the liberation of Puerto Rico, but I left as an internationalist. By that time, I was like thinking of Cuba. I was thinking of, what was going on in, all over the world, but I was also studying, so the world had opened up for me. And, I just, yeah, it was beautiful for me, Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And you are a wonderful speaker, Anna. You should have confidence in your incredible skills. I have an all-star panel that's been put together today. So folks in the listening audience, the webinar chat is open for you guys to make any questions. We all have access to the webinar chat, so everyone will be able to see questions. So please post any questions that you have.
Okay. If there's no questions, there's a couple of things I did want to say that I remembered after I heard both Lulu and Anna. We never talked about la consigna of the Latin Women's Collective,
Yes.
which is really important. So it's la liberación de la mujer a través de la
Través
lucha
obrera.
obrera.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was a really important consigna for us, which we really worked on because we had some class analysis. And we really felt like, as Lulu has talked about, and Anna as well, this whole question of becoming a womanist as opposed to a feminist. We really were not identified as feminist in the traditional sense of the word. I also want to talk about the fact that many of us came from these working class backgrounds.
Right.
And so we had these working class values, and that those values really did shape the way that we organized with each other, where we were really struggling to have ethical behaviors. We really were trying to be responsible. Criticism, self-criticism became very different, as Lulu said. It wasn't about beating each other up. It really was about, we do this with love because we want people to improve, not just their behaviors, not just their practice, but because when you get feedback, there's something that happens inside of you where you start to shift and change, as Anna said, right? You become like another person. So I think that was really important. The other thing is that we were actually a very diverse group, not just in terms of class, although most of us were, from the working class, but we're professional people in one capacity or another. But we had Chicanas, we had Dominicanas, we had Puerto Ricans, we had African American women, and we had white women, and we had a lot of conversation about having white women with us. But we were really open to the fact that if other women from other groups were interested in supporting the liberation of Latinas, that then they could work with us. And so we were very open about that, even though we had some pitched battles. I still remember some of them about white women in particular. But yeah, so we were a very diverse group. It was a very wonderful experience, as I think each one of us has said. I'm just hoping that somebody has a question or a comment. Vamos a ver. Gente,
well,
pregunta.
There is a comment. Can you write the consigna in the chat? I think Lulu, I just actually have a question as well. I think it's very important that we start giving some definitions to some of these terms. What is the difference between feminism and womanism?
Well, I would say for me, right? Because everybody's going to have a different interpretation of it. For me, feminism is really rooted in middle class and upper class white women looking for the same entitlement as white men. And that doesn't mean that that's a judgment. It's just that that's a reality. Our experience, as Lulu talked about, was that of, more working class and poor and oppressed women, very oppressed women. So some of the things that the white women were struggling for were things that were not attainable for many of us and many of the women that we were talking about. So womanist is much more about, I think it's much more class based. It's really about working class women and the needs of working class women and women of color in particular, because, we have intersectionality with women of color. It isn't just about sexism. It isn't just about patriarchy and misogyny. It's also about racism and the way that racism has an impact on our lives, especially those of us that are Black or look Black. For those of us that are more light skinned, we don't have the same issues as Black Puerto Ricans or Black Dominicans, Black Latinas. But that intersectionality is really critical, and many of us seeing us as womanist.
One thing that I wanted to also mention, just real quick, we called ourselves La Colectiva, right? We refuse to call ourselves El Colectivo, which is what a collective in Spanish. In Spanish, collective is masculine.
Yeah.
We feminized it and said La Colectiva de Mujeres Latinas. And it gladdens me to see that there is a colectiva in Puerto Rico today. And they call themselves La Colectiva. So, we tried also through language to make clear that this was a women's organization for women. And so that, people are always correcting us. No, es colectivo. No, es la colectiva.
Yeah. I guess I want to say something more in not only that was hard to do because obviously some people are, get things a little faster or, it can express themselves easier. But there was a lot of attention given, and that's part of, and opportunity to criticize and to do self-criticism. And so, I think that helped me a lot in this whole process of being a Latina woman, being part of the Latina Women's Collective. And there's so many women that I feel grateful to. I think we need to mention some of them. I didn't mention Elie Roman, who I don't know where she is these days. I tried getting a hold of her to see if she would join us today. But I do want to say that thanks to Ellie, I felt like I had a soul sister there, and then of course Esperanza to this day, I have my talks with her, and Karen Slotnick was a white woman there, but a really lovely white woman who understood the we all have different interpretations of I relied on her a lot. She was a good sister to me. I remember somebody from El Comité called Liz Figueroa. I really want to give her like a shout out because she was such when we had events, El Comité would come, all the members, as many as could, obviously. And Liz was one of those people. A couple of times I struggled so that I could be a speaker or say something, and not get cut off. But and Liz was, I remember asking for a question, and it was actually when we were celebrating the Vietnamese a triumphant of their revolution, and her, asking a question, and I always remember her just for that day, her participation in our event. Also, Marieta la Colombiana, who and one of my roommates at one point, incredible woman. And I have to, there are many more, but I'll just keep quiet now for the minute. Sandy, I just want to say one more thing about Sandy and that education committee. And Karen, if you're on, say something about it, write something in the text or whatever you call that thing, the chat. Yes.
Two questions.
The education committee, that was the powerhouse there.
Two questions. One from Jose Alfaro. What role might a Latin women's collective play today, and why isn't there one if you think it's important? And Angel Roman wrote, at the peak, how many women were in the Latin women's collective? I send it out to all of you.
I'm gonna answer Angel's question. I think at its peak, because we had people who were not members, they were supporters, but I'm going to say anywhere, around 60 people in and out. But there were probably more in terms of like supporters, people who would come to the events, people who would help out. And we did a lot of fundraising. We had great parties. We raised a lot of money. And they cooked. Yeah, so they brought food or they did daycare. Yeah, we had a lot of people who were supporters. Yeah, so I would say probably in and out, right? Every year was different, in and out. About 60. I think I'm not sure that there could be a Latin women's collective at this historical moment. I think we have to really locate the women's collective as part of a series of movements that developed internationally and in the United States. So we were part of that wave of a political movement. We had all been informed by the civil rights movement. We had been informed by the national wars of liberation. We're in a very different historical moment right now. And I'm not sure that women would organize as Latinas. I have found in my limited organizing with folks around Palestine, which was a very diverse group of people, very diverse, was that there was not an affinity for Latin folks. Yeah, I think it would be great, but I'm not so sure that in this historical moment there is a movement that would compel Latinas to organize. I think that there's been so many organizations of Latinas, little pockets of different Latinas, and they have been really much more middle class. After the Latin Women's Collective, we used to talk about the NACOPRO, which was the middle class Latinas who organized the National Association of Puerto Rican Women or something like that, NACOPRO. And, it was headed by Marife Hernandez, who used to be on WPIX or something, very aristocratic Puerto Rican woman. And I went to a couple of the meetings as a representative from the Latin Women's Collective, and I would always talk about working class women, and they were appalled. Alice Cardona was a part of it. Yolanda Sanchez was a part of it. I mean, so it was much more of a, professional women's organization. It was not interested in working class women per se. It wasn't about organizing. It was about organizing middle class professional women. That's what I would say.
I think in response to that same question, it would take a different way of organizing because back then the predominant community here was Puerto Rican, right? We had a large Puerto Rican community. We were a developing Dominican community that was going. Now we're talking about 50 years later, and the Latino landscape has changed. There are a lot of immigrants that have come, a lot of undocumented women that are going through all kinds of changes. And I think part of the issues that today Puerto Ricans have to look at is identifying with the rest of Latin America and the Caribbean, right? Because we're citizens, it tends to be, as generations go further away from Puerto Rico and from the culture, there tends to be sometimes just not even able to identify with other Latinos or to identify just in very superficial ways. And I think an organization of Latina women really would have to focus on finding the things that unite us as Latinas,
Right.
unite us as women, with a very, very special emphasis, I think, on immigrant women and on working class women. We have an immigrant issue here that is really critical in our communities. I can get picked up because I look like anybody from Latin America. It's no longer just the Puerto Rican issue. It is a Latino issue, it's a Caribbean issue. And so a Latin Women's Collective today would have to really focus on the diversity of that community. Who are we today as Latinas? What do our communities consist of? When we say Latinas, what does that mean? And what are the specific needs within that community? There are those of us who are citizens, and there are those of us who are not. There are those of us who can get jobs easily. There are those of us who are not undocumented. There are those of us who can fight openly for certain rights. There are those of us who cannot. So how do we bring a group of women together that is able to address those fundamental issues while also addressing the issues that unite us all? Right? Daycare, children, our exploitation in general. So many things that can come together, but it really requires a real serious discussion among us as women and as Latinas. What does that mean to be a Latina today? What does it mean to be a Caribbean woman today? What are the issues that face us? And what are the commonalities and what are the differences? That would be my answer to your question, Jose.
Oh, yeah. Well, good. Okay, super. Can I just say one thing I think it's really important for us to understand the historical moment that we're in.
Right.
So there's this idea that, oh, we should just do this, right? Well, wait a minute. What are the factors? What are the forces that are happening in this moment historically that would preclude a Latin women's organization, right? So Lulu has talked about some of them, but I think what's sort of a more meta look at it is that we're in the midst of a fascist takeover of the United States. And so I think we have to look at that many people feel totally buffeted by. Every day there's a new situation in the news that people feel is totally out of their control. And it's, few people who are organizing along identity lines. When I go out on Saturdays, Indivisible and Rockland Forward are the two groups that organize Saturday demonstrations that I attend. There's hardly any Latinas there. There's hardly any people of color there. The reality is that most of the people are hiding because they're scared shitless because they're going to be picked up, even in Rockland. I mean, we had a client where I work who's an immigrant who was in the process of, stabilizing his residency, and they picked him up. And it took us, I don't know how long, to get him out of some place in Louisiana. And we had to be so incredibly creative in order to do that. So I think the reality of this historical moment has to really be looked at, and is the moment for multi-sector, intersectional organizing, because the issues are so broad right now. It's an anti-immigration sentiment across the country. It isn't just that we have these awful people in government that are brutalizing immigrants. It's that people in the United States hate immigrants.
Right.
And
Working
so
people.
Working class people who hate immigrants and have bought the bullshit about them being criminals. So I think it's really looking at organized labor. Where are we with organized labor? What is the story and the status of identity politics in this historical moment? You know, where's the left in general? Where's the Puerto Rican left? The Puerto Rican left has been practically decimated. I mean, if you look at it, not, you know, when you think about back in the day, right? When we would bring hundreds of people together, that's not necessarily the case, as I understand it today. So I think we have to really think about what's happening in this moment and what is called for. I don't think we can look at what used to be and say, oh, we need that. I think it's what do we need now?
Yeah. No, I wanted to say that I agree with some of what you're saying, Lillian, because really, there people are aware of their oppression, of what is going on in their communities, what makes them, the suffering, like just, our rights, things that we fought for are just like being pulled away. The racism, how blatant it has become, even more than ever. And that is like, one of the things I've learned in terms of my, my activism. I work with several groups, obviously now, not only the radical elders, but the that Black liberation movement. What's been done to the civil rights, and how people we have to expand. We have to expand our understanding of how society works, how we're all really needed, and how it's not only immigrants, but Black labor has been used to to build wealth, to steal from the native people, even the American natives, the indigenous communities. And it's just and women and men, we're needed to work together. It's great. We find each other. I have my women friends. We find each other, and we make.
Anna?
You're frozen, Anna.
Anna, you're frozen. We might be having some connectivity issues with Anna.
She might be having connectivity issues.
Yeah.
Not us. I mean, we don't know.
Okay. Anna will continue on when she jumps back in, just recognizing the time.
New friendships in the struggle. I still Karen Slot so forth. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you
anyway. Now. Oh, yeah, I just wanted to say that, in the struggle now, I meet up with my women friends. I count on many to come back. Karen Slotnick, we march together still, you know what I'm saying? Afro-Boricos, I march with them also as well. It's just, we have to sort of not be afraid, because fascism is scary. And we have to just come out, and encourage each other to be present. That's all. You have to be present. Doesn't mean you have to be the main organizer. Doesn't have to mean that you are, because we're fighting not only for ourselves, but we're resisting. We're present for our families. My sisters, they're still to this day, very sheltered on the Lower East Side, and I go to visit them. I send them materials and information, and people, it's a struggle to survive these today, and fear is a factor also. But anyway,
Lillian, closing us out.
No, I'm sorry. What?
Your hand is up.
Oh, sorry, I didn't realize my hand was up. Sorry, I was just going to ask Lulu if she would. There's a question around women in the labor force. If she would respond to that. Did you see it in the Q&A, Lulu?
No.
Okay.
It's from Juisa.
Yes.
What role did La Colectiva play in the labor movement?
I mean, there were some of us who were, active we were workers. Some of us were workers. We were a smaller group within the Latin Women's Collective, but the labor movement, as we saw it, wasn't just unions, but it was, talking about the kind of wages that women were making, especially women in the garment industry, which is where many of us came from. We came from mothers that have been part of the garment industry or had worked in hotels or had worked, our parents had been, doormen. We came from those working people that later on became part of 1199. They became part of SEIU, 32BJ. All those unions come from struggles that our people waged. Puerto Ricans were critical in the formation with the African American community, for example, of 1199 and of Local 32BJ. So we come from that history. We were the daughters of those working people that had fought. We were the daughters of the folks who were in the International Ladies Garment Workers Union at the time, right? These were the garment workers that later on unite and become part of Unite, another union. So we were very conscious of where we came from and that our parents were in unions or had come from struggles in unions, that we were not involved in workshop organizing. That wasn't something that was happening in the Latin Women's Collective, but we did try to do the kind of programs and the kind of plays and the kind of events where we highlighted the situation of working women in not only in our IWWD events, but in different events that we had. We highlighted what was happening with working women, what were the wages that working women were getting. We talked about la doble jornada, of women working all day and then coming home to raise children and cook and clean. So we were very conscious about working women, and we raised those issues as much as we could within our events and our activities and in our literature. So that was our experience then. Today,
we were working women anyway, we were working.
Yes.
We were all working women,
But she's talking about the labor movement. The question was about
the labor movement. But what are you going to, we're always a part of it, whether we're organized or not. That's the issue, and so many of these labor unions are such shams, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry.
So that was what we were doing. We were recogiendo esa historia, gathering that story and bringing it back in our activities and our events and raising those issues that working women were facing in factories and hospitals, wherever, and expressing our solidarity with them and our need to support them in the struggles that they were waging.
Thank you.
I just remember one quickie thing. During the time of the Latin Women's Collective, I was involved in making a film about women who were, the caregivers, and now they're called something else,
domestic workers.
Home health attendants.
Right.
And part of the reality was that I was helping to organize them. So I'm making a film about them, but I'm also, helping to organize them because they didn't have any organizing experience. Right. And so, that was part of the Latin Women's Collective.
Yes.
And I made the film, What Could You Do with a Nickel? Which is about them becoming active, and they went with the Teamsters, and the Teamsters, like Anna said, they were full of shit. They dropped them when they realized they couldn't make any money out of them. That was that labor unionism. And then they went with 1199, and one of the women who was working there went to work as an organizer for 1199, and that was in the film. So, there were different ways in which we engaged with women in the workforce and in the labor movement, or who were trying to get into the labor movement. Anyway, Ben, did you want to close us out?
Yes, we have reached our time limit for our webinar. In the chat, I put in the Pro Libertad website as well as the way to contact us. I think it's very obvious, and I'm going to just tell our listening audience that our sisters in this panel have been talking about the need to have a greater conversation and have more panelists from the Latin Women's Collective together. So I think we're all going to encourage them. Another Zoom, maybe even an in-person activity. But thank you all for listening to us today. We've reached our time limit. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you to our all-star panel. There is a need Hermanas, there's a need for the Latin Women's Collective to be further discussed. We've got a lot of questions we want to ask and a lot more we want to do. So maybe something in person in New York or yet another webinar. So thank you all. Que viva Puerto Rico Libre.
Thank you for inviting us. Thank you
for your work, Ben, for the
Que viva la
political
mujer.
prisoners.
Que viva la mujer.